After my mother-in-law's funeral, I found her will. The name on it wasn't mine. Rain poured down as we drove back from the cemetery, droplets racing across the windshield like tears seeking escape. I watched them merge and divide, creating patterns that seemed to mock the chaos I felt inside. The small gathering of mourners had dispersed quickly. A few of Margaret's old colleagues from the university, where she'd taught English literature for 3 decades, an elderly neighbor who'd brought a casserole every Sunday for years, Robert's cousin from Seattle who'd flown in for the day and would leave tomorrow morning. No one had lingered. Even in death, Margaret Harrington hadn't inspired warmth or fond reminiscence, just dutiful respect and a certain relief that the long decline was over. I clutched the small black umbrella she had given me years ago for some forgotten Christmas, my hands cramping around its handle. It was expensive, of course, Italian-made, with a carved wooden grip that bore the maker's insignia. Margaret never bought anything but the best. "Quality endures," she would say, eyeing my Target sweater or department store shoes with that slight downward tilt of her chin that conveyed volumes without a word being spoken. Even now, standing at her graveside, I'd used her umbrella and thought of her assessing gaze. Even in death, I couldn't escape her presence. I glanced at my reflection in the rear-view mirror, tired eyes with dark circles beneath them, deepening wrinkles around my mouth, hair sprinkled with gray I'd given up trying to conceal months ago. Who had time for hair appointments when there were medications to administer, doctors to consult, and sheets to change? At 42, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. When I met Robert at 30, I'd been ambitious, full of plans for my financial analyst career, weekend hiking trips in the White Mountains, and eventually a small cottage with a garden where I could grow heirloom tomatoes and fragrant herbs. 15 years of marriage later, those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else, a woman I used to know but couldn't quite remember anymore. "Are you all right?" Robert asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, but his voice was steady. Steady, always controlled. That was Robert. In 15 years of marriage, I'd seen him truly angry only twice, and truly vulnerable perhaps 3 times. He maintained the same even keel his mother had prized so highly. "Emotional displays are for those who lack self-mastery," Margaret would say, usually after I'd laughed too loudly at a dinner party or cried during a movie. "I'm fine," I answered automatically. It was what I always said, what was expected. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting my answer without question, and I felt a flicker of annoyance. Would it kill him to probe deeper, to recognize that fine was what people said when they were anything but? But that wasn't how we operated. Our marriage ran on smooth efficiency and unspoken expectations. A well-oiled machine that delivered comfort and stability, if not passion. The service had been as austere as Margaret herself. No flowers beyond the modest arrangement I'd ordered. No eulogies except for Robert's brief, composed speech about his mother's dedication to education and literature. No personal anecdotes, no tearful remembrances. Just as she would have wanted it. I watched him at the cemetery, his face a mask of dignified grief, and wondered if beneath that composure he felt relieved. His mother had been demanding in health and utterly consuming in illness. For 3 years, I'd been her primary caregiver, administering medications at precise intervals, preparing special meals that adhered to her strict dietary preferences, driving to endless doctor's appointments, and in the final months, helping her bathe and use the bathroom. I'd learned to dress bed sores, to recognize the subtle changes in breathing that presaged one of her episodes, to read aloud for hours in the particular cadence she preferred. I'd quit my job when her condition worsened after the second stroke. Robert's banking career couldn't accommodate the constant attention she required, so the responsibility fell to me. Not that I complained, at least not out loud. That wasn't how our arrangement worked. Margaret had generously allowed us to move into her spacious Victorian after our wedding. "No point in wasting money on rent when there's all this space," she'd said, gesturing around the house that had been in her late husband's family for generations. The unspoken agreement was that we would care for her in her old age. Fair enough. The house itself was a showpiece, a 3-story Queen Anne with a wrap-around porch, original woodwork, and a location in the most desirable historic district in town. We lived in the main bedroom on the second floor, while Margaret occupied the master suite on the first floor, converted from a formal dining room and adjacent study after climbing stairs became difficult for her. Every morning for the past 3 years, I'd risen at 6 to start her day. Medications, breakfast, a sponge bath, fresh clothes. Every night, I'd ended my day the same way. Medications, nightcap of warm milk with honey, another sponge bath, fresh nightgown, clean sheets. I never loved the woman, with her cutting remarks about my practical clothes and quaint upbringing in rural Pennsylvania, but I respected the arrangement. Robert was devoted to his mother, and I was devoted to Robert. Simple as that. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I'd always assumed the house would eventually be ours. Why wouldn't it be? Robert was her only child. I was his wife. I'd spent the last 3 years changing her sheets, managing her medications, reading aloud from her beloved Jane Austen while she drifted in and out of consciousness. Even if she didn't appreciate me in life, surely she would acknowledge my dedication in death. We pulled into the driveway of the grand old house, its gabled roof and decorative trim somber in the rain. For a moment, neither of us moved, as if reluctant to enter a space so long dominated by Margaret's presence. Would it feel empty now? Or would her spirit linger in the antique furniture she polished religiously, in the library of leather-bound classics she'd collected over decades? "We should go through Mom's papers," Robert said when we finally made it inside. The house eerily quiet without Margaret's television constantly playing British murder mysteries in the background. "Get everything sorted." "Not today," I sighed, exhaustion washing over me like a physical weight. 3 years of fragmented sleep and constant vigilance had left me perpetually tired. "I just need to rest." "I think we should do it now," he insisted, his voice carrying an unusual edge. He was still wearing his funeral suit, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe, Margaret's Christmas gift 2 years ago. Something in his tone made me pause. "The lawyer left some documents. We need to review them. Can't it wait until tomorrow?" I was already envisioning a hot bath, perhaps a glass of wine, small luxuries I'd denied myself while caring for Margaret, who considered baths wasteful and alcohol vulgar. "I'd rather do it now," he said firmly. This assertiveness was unlike him, and I felt a flicker of unease. I followed him to the study, Margaret's domain, with its antique mahogany desk and walls lined with leather-bound classics. The room still smelled of her perfume, Joy by Jean Patou, which she'd worn daily even when bedridden. Robert pulled out a folder from the desk drawer and laid several papers on the polished surface. On top was her will, neatly printed with an official seal. "I thought we'd gone through this already," I said. Margaret had made her will years ago, after her husband died. She'd shown it to Robert, explained that everything would go to him as her only child. I'd been in the room when they discussed it, though I'd paid little attention to the details. It had seemed straightforward enough. "This is a new one," Robert said, his voice carefully neutral. She had it drawn up 2 years ago, after her first stroke. I began to read, the words blurring then sharpening with terrible clarity. "I, Margaret Eleanor Harrington, being of sound mind and memory, bequeath my house at 47 Maple Avenue to my niece, Elizabeth Ann Crawford." I read the sentence 3 times, certain I'd misunderstood. Elizabeth? Margaret's niece, who visited maybe twice a year, sending expensive but impersonal gifts at Christmas? Elizabeth, who lived in Boston with her successful architect husband and 2 perfect children? Elizabeth, who called occasionally but never stayed long enough to help with Margaret's care. What is this? My voice sounded strange, distant, as if someone else were speaking. Why would she leave the house to Elizabeth? Robert shrugged, not meeting my eyes. It's what she wanted. But you're her son. We've lived here for 15 years. I took care of her. The shock was giving way to something else. Indignation, betrayal, a rising tide of anger. We put our lives on hold for her. I quit my job. It was her house, Diane. Her decision? His tone was maddeningly calm, as if we were discussing someone else's inheritance, not our home. Did you know about this? The question hung between us, though somehow I already knew the answer. Something in his demeanor, the careful way he'd brought up the papers, his insistence on reviewing them immediately, told me this wasn't a surprise to him. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. She told me after the first stroke, about 2 years ago. The room seemed to tilt sideways, the oriental rug with its intricate pattern, the bookshelves I'd dusted weekly, the antique globe I'd been forbidden to touch. All of it felt suddenly alien, as if I were seeing it for the first time. 2 years? You've known for 2 years that she was giving away our home, and you never thought to mention it? What good would it have done? There was defensiveness in his voice now. It would have just created tension while she was still alive. Created tension? I was almost shouting now, my voice bouncing off the walnut-paneled walls. As opposed to the complete betrayal I'm feeling right now? I spent 3 years cleaning up after her, bathing her, reading to her, all while you knew she was planning to throw us out? She wasn't throwing us out, Robert said wearily, loosening his tie with one finger. It was a nervous habit he'd had since I met him, this small gesture of seeking relief from constriction. The will gives us 6 months to find another place. And Mom left us some money too. Not a fortune, but enough for a down payment on something modest. Modest, I repeated, the word bitter in my mouth. After 15 years in this house with its high ceilings and original moldings, its spacious rooms and mature gardens, we were expected to be grateful for something modest. And more to the point, that's not the issue, Robert. Why wouldn't she leave the house to you? To us? It doesn't make any sense. I stared at him, this man I'd shared a bed with for 15 years, and felt as if I were seeing a stranger. His face, handsome in a conventional way, with its straight nose and determined chin, was a mask of discomfort, but not surprise. Definitely not surprise. Why would she do this? Why would you let her? He was quiet for a long moment, adjusting a pen on the desk so it lay perfectly parallel to the edge. She always worried that you married me for security, for the house. The accusation landed like a physical blow. All those years of dutiful care, of sublimating my own needs and desires to fit into the Harrington family mold. And this was what Margaret thought of me? That's what she thought of me? After 15 years? After everything I did for her? Tears burned my eyes, not sad ones, but angry ones. And what did you say when she told you that? Did you defend me at all? I told her she was wrong, he said, but there was something hesitant in his voice, a slight pause that spoke volumes. But Mom was, you know how she was. Once she made up her mind, so you just went along with it, like you always did. The truth of our marriage was crystallizing with painful clarity. For 15 years, I'd thought of us as partners, as a team. But faced with a choice between his mother's wishes and my well-being, he'd chosen her, without even the courtesy of telling me. You let her believe I was some kind of gold digger, and you didn't say a word to me. All those nights I sat by her bed, all those days I spent taking her to doctors. You knew she thought so little of me that she'd rather give her house to a niece who barely visited. It's not like that, Robert protested, but weakly. His shoulders slumped slightly, the only visible sign of his distress. Elizabeth was like a daughter to her. They shared so much, the same alma mater, the same love of literature. Mom was proud of her academic achievements. And I was just the caretaker, I said quietly. The convenience. That's not fair, he started, but the phone rang, cutting through the tension. Robert answered, his posture stiffening as he recognized the caller. Yes, hello, Elizabeth. Yes, the service was nice, small, as she would have wanted. He glanced at me uncomfortably. Yes, we've just been going through her papers. I walked out of the room, unable to listen to his polite conversation with the woman who was about to inherit my home. In the kitchen, my domain at least, I mechanically put on the kettle, a habit from thousands of afternoons making tea for Margaret. Earl Grey, steeped for exactly 4 minutes, with a single teaspoon of honey and a thin slice of lemon. Never milk. Only barbarians put milk in Earl Grey, Margaret would say, though never when guests who took milk were present. She reserved her judgments for private, shared with the subtle raise of an eyebrow that invited complicity. The familiar routine felt suddenly hollow, meaningless. For 15 years, I'd been adjusting myself to fit Margaret's expectations, speaking more softly, dressing more conservatively, even adopting her tea preferences. I'd done it for Robert, of course, because I loved him, because I wanted our marriage to work, because I thought if I tried hard enough, I could earn Margaret's approval, and by extension, secure my place in the family. Through the kitchen window, I could see the garden where I'd planted roses 3 summers ago, thinking I'd have years to watch them mature. heritage varieties that Margaret had suggested, old-fashioned blooms with intoxicating scents that were superior to those gaudy modern hybrids. I'd spent countless hours tending those roses, pruning them according to Margaret's exacting instructions, nursing them through black spot and aphid invasions. The brass drawer pulls in the kitchen that I'd polished countless times with the special imported polish Margaret insisted was the only acceptable brand. The wallpaper I'd helped Margaret select when we redecorated 5 years back. A William Morris pattern that was classically tasteful, unlike the trendy nonsense I'd initially suggested. All of it had felt like investing in my future. Our future? Building a life in this house where we would grow old together, where we might even have raised children if things had worked out differently. Now I realized I'd been building a life on sand. None of it had been mine. Not the house, not the garden, not even my marriage, apparently. I'd spent 15 years trying to become the wife Margaret thought worthy of her son, and I'd failed so completely that she'd rather give her home to a niece who shared her background and interests than to the woman who'd cared for her in her final years. Robert found me an hour later, sitting motionless at the kitchen table, my tea long cold. He'd changed out of his funeral suit into jeans and a sweater, his concession to comfort, now that his mother was no longer here to disapprove of casual dress after 5 p.m. "Elizabeth sends her condolences," he said carefully, testing the waters. "She mentioned that she's not planning to move in. She'll probably sell the house." "So a stranger will live here instead," I said flatly. "That's so much better." "Diane, we'll be fine. We can find our own place, somewhere that's truly ours." He reached for my hand across the table, a rare gesture of physical affection. We'd never been a demonstrative couple, partly due to Margaret's constant presence, partly due to Robert's natural reserve. But I pulled away, unable to bear his touch right now. "That's not the point, Robert. For 15 years, I've tried to be part of this family. I've bent over backward to please your mother, to make this marriage work. I changed how I dress, how I speak, what I eat, everything about myself to fit in here. And all this time, she saw me as an outsider, a gold digger. And you?" I looked up at him, this man I'd once thought was my partner. "You let her. You knew what she thought of me, and you did nothing. What was I supposed to do?" There was frustration in his voice now, a crack in the calm facade. "Challenge her when she was ill? Fight over property when she was dying? You were supposed to stand up for me, for us, for our marriage." I stood up, suddenly needing to move, to act. The kitchen felt stifling, every surface a reminder of my years of willing subjugation to Margaret's standards. But there never really was an us, was there? It was always you and her, with me on the outside, looking in. "That's not true," he protested, but weakly. "I love you, Diane." "Do you?" I asked, and it wasn't a rhetorical. I genuinely wondered. "Or do you just need me? There's a difference, Robert." He had no answer for that. I walked past him, out of the kitchen and up the stairs to our bedroom. No, not ours, never truly ours. It had been a guest room before we moved in, decorated in Margaret's taste with heavy curtains and a 4-poster bed that Robert's grandfather had brought from England. We'd never changed it, never made it our own. Like everything else in this house, we'd simply adapted ourselves to what already existed. I pulled my suitcase from the closet, the same suitcase I'd brought when I moved in after our wedding, ironically enough. It was a cheap thing, navy blue with a broken wheel, purchased during my less affluent days. Margaret had commented on it then. "We must get you proper luggage, dear. A Harrington can't travel with that." But somehow we never had. There had always been more important expenses, more pressing concerns. Robert followed me, alarm growing in his eyes as he watched me pull clothes from drawers. "What are you doing?" "What does it look like?" "I'm leaving." I began folding blouses, the conservative ones in muted colors that Margaret had approved of, and placing them in the suitcase. "Diane, please, this is crazy. We can talk about this, figure it out." He hovered in the doorway, looking lost. "We don't have to decide anything right now. Mom just died. We're both emotional." "I've already decided." My voice was calm now, eerily so. The shock had passed, replaced by a strange clarity. "I can't stay here anymore. Not in this house, not in this marriage." "Where will you go?" he asked, a note of panic creeping into his voice. "To Claire's, for now." My sister had been telling me for years that I gave too much to the Harringtons and got too little in return. She'd take me in without question, without judgment. For how long? I don't know. It was the truth. For the first time in 15 years, I had no plan, no roadmap to follow. Just the certainty that I couldn't spend another night in this house where I'd never truly belonged. "Please don't do this," Robert said, and now there was real fear in his voice. "I need you." I paused, a handful of socks in my hand. "See? That's just it. You need me. You don't love me, not really. You love what I do for you, the stability, the care, the way I've molded myself to fit your life. But that's not love, Robert. That's convenience." "That's not fair," he said, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Isn't it? When was the last time you asked what I wanted? What would make me happy?" I resumed packing, now grabbing toiletries from the ensuite bathroom. I can't remember either, because somewhere along the way, my wants and needs became secondary. First to your mother's, then to the routine we established. And I let it happen because I thought we were building something together. But we weren't, were we? I was just maintaining what already existed. Your mother's house, your mother's standards, your mother's vision of what a proper wife should be. "I never asked you to change for me," he said defensively. "You never had to. It was understood. If I wanted to be a Harrington, I had to become someone else." I zipped the suitcase with finality. And now I find out that no matter how hard I tried, I was never going to be accepted anyway. I was always going to be the outsider, the gold digger who wasn't good enough for the family home. "Mom was wrong about you," Robert said quietly. "I know how much you've given up for us." "Do you?" Because you never seemed to notice. I made a few calls, to Claire, to a car service, while Robert watched helplessly. When the driver texted that he'd arrived, Robert followed me down the stairs like a shadow. "Can we at least talk tomorrow? After we've both had time to think?" He looked smaller somehow, diminished without the ancestral home to bolster his presence. I don't know what else there is to say. I stood in the doorway of the house where I'd spent 15 years of my life and felt nothing but exhaustion. Your mother's will said everything that needed saying. "A will is just about property," he protested weakly, I shook my head. No, Robert. A will isn't about money or property. It's about who you believe belongs in your story and who doesn't. Your mother made her choice. Now I'm making mine. I stepped outside into the rain, not bothering with Margaret's expensive umbrella. The water felt cleansing somehow, washing away years of pretense. The car waited at the curb. Nothing fancy, just a practical sedan that would take me away from this life I'd outgrown. "I'll call you," Robert said from the doorway, his voice almost lost in the sound of rain on pavement. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak again. Then I got into the car, my cheap suitcase beside me, and gave the driver Claire's address. We pulled away from the curb, and I didn't look back at the house with its gabled roof and wraparound porch, its manicured lawn and heritage roses. I'd spent 15 years trying to belong there, but now I understood. Some places are never meant to be home, no matter how long you stay, or how hard you try to fit yourself into their existing shape. As the neighborhood receded behind me, I felt a curious lightness growing. Not happiness, not yet, but possibility. For the first time in years, my future was unwritten, undefined by others' expectations. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Whatever came next would be my choice, my story. I would grieve this marriage, this life I'd built so carefully. But I wouldn't regret leaving. Sometimes the truest inheritance isn't what's left to you in a will, but what you discover when the pretenses fall away. Your own worth, your own voice, your own path forward. And for now, that was enough.